Thank you all so much for being here. We're super excited to be studying, of course, this incredibly important text with you, and to be here for week 3, where we're going to be discussing chapter 3, his chapter on the planter class, the dominant class in the South. But we want to start by recognizing the fact that, as you can see behind me, yesterday was the great W.B. Du Bois's birthday, and we do want to mark that and do want to celebrate that, 1868 till infinity. We're talking about someone who's made incredible contributions, and at Abolition School, we don't idolize or glorify or deify any individual, right? We never make any kind of claims with regard to a certain thinker or, inspiration or scholar or revolutionary to be infallible, perfect, any of the above. But we do need to recognize the real accomplishments and the real contributions that people make, right? And so at any point when it seems like we're sort of celebrating too much, that means that to us, we're talking about the incredible contributions that this great revolutionary internationalist, communist, scholar of sociology, of history, of Marxism, of, Pan-African revolutionary movements has offered to and contributed to the world, right? This is just one of the texts. It's one that's incredibly important for us, but we're talking about someone who has done and contributed so much. And so we do want to mark that, and we do want to recognize that. The fact that we're grappling with this text today in 2025 is a testament to just how important this work is, and the legacy that Du Bois has left us. So, we definitely want to mark that by saying, of course, happy birthday to the GOAT before we move on. We begin, as we often begin, by thinking about some of the pieces that we talked about last week. For those who are maybe new to the seminar, we began our very first week with a conversation about the last chapter of the book, which is Du Bois' analysis of the propaganda of history, his analysis of the historical, textbooks and mainstream common sense about Reconstruction that he was confronting. And then we moved back to the beginning of the text last week to talk about chapters 1 and 2, which are these kind of parallel chapters about two incredibly important classes that he is going to center in this text, namely the black worker and the white worker. We talked about the ways in which simply by calling enslaved people and poor whites jointly workers, Du Bois was doing something very important, right? And something that wasn't fully accepted in his time, right? First of all, he's stretching Marxist categories, which understood on the one hand, workers to mean the waged working class in developed capitalist countries, right? And which understood enslaved people to be a sort of leftover from a previous historical era, right? Representatives of a mode of production that's located in the past, right? And yet Du Bois knows and sees that this is not the past, right? That this is the present, and that it's incredibly central to the way that we understand capitalism today, but also historically, right? Again, we use the phrase racial capitalism to talk about the fact that race has been central to capitalism from the beginning, which means that we need to adjust these categories. That's what Du Bois is doing. And he's doing it by centering slavery within capitalism. We saw last week the fact that he talks about how the emergence of King Cotton, the huge importance of the value of cotton for the U.S. South, re-energized and increased dramatically the importance of slavery for the U.S. South and made it the center of the global economy for Du Bois, right? He's not saying it's just another, it'd already be one thing for him to say this is another form of production or relation of production that exists under global capitalism, but he was also saying this was the center of it, right? That cotton produced massive profits that fueled northern industry. That cotton went to northern industrial centers, textile mills, right? It went to England, it went to France, it played a massive role. He's also doing something very important, which is to, we raised this last time under the guise of asking, well, why does he call black workers and white workers workers? But then why does he write different chapters about them, right? And so he's signaling in a certain way the fact that they are both workers, but that there's something that's keeping them apart, right? There's some potential for class unity, which is crucial, and there's some threat to barrier to that class unity that's also incredibly important to him. And that's actually going to be the story of the book, right? If there was no potential for unity among poor whites and poor blacks, according to Du Bois, and this is really important to understand, he wouldn't have written 800 pages. He's writing about a process of betrayal, a history of the possibility of workers unifying, understanding, what they could accomplish together and carrying that out, And he's talking about the way that that was historically betrayed. But for Du Bois, none of this was a foregone conclusion. It's part of the story. We talked about, in the course of that analysis, about how Du Bois shows that slavery, the importance of slavery, and the white supremacy that goes along with it, particularly in its modern kind of variant, is not eternal, right? He shows the emergence, the reconsolidation of slavery as a racial phenomenon in US history. And he shows that with that, you had the construction and the reinforcement of a racial binary. Talks about the fact that there were, lots of free, Black Americans in the 16 and 1700s, that there was a process of trying to eliminate that category, that forced labor, specifically what we call indentured servitude, was, it existed for Black people, for white people, for people that were considered somewhere in between. But that process was simplified into a racial binary that we know today. But that was a historical process, and it was a historical project that found its origins for Du Bois in the massive profits that cotton offered, right? You have a system offering huge amounts of money. You need to justify the exploitation that's required to support that process. And you're willing to, and you're forced to, in fact, create racial moral justifications for why that exploitation is okay. That's more or less how the process works for Du Bois. And this process of new justification creates many more, but two key forms of control that we talked about last week. The first was the police, right? He's identifying as early as the first chapter of this book the function of the police in US history, right? And we often, again, tell this very important story about the way that US police are descended from slave catchers. And that's a key part of it, but it's also much, much bigger than the institution, because essentially what Du Bois is saying is that all white people in the US South were able to play the function of police, right? And that's part of what made the system so stable. The second piece, and an integral piece of understanding how that happens, is what we refer to as the wages of whiteness. The various ways in which particularly poor whites in the US South are bought off, are paid off, in forms that are both material and psychological. And it's important to understand that both of those pieces are there, right? Often this is described in purely psychological terms, which are incredibly important, and we see them everywhere, which is to say, if you don't have shit in your life, if you have a terrible life, if you're poor, if you're downtrodden, if you have no resources, if you're excluded, which was the case, as Du Bois describes it, for many Southern poor whites, it matters that you can feel better than someone, right? A sense of superiority becomes even more important in that context if you don't have anything else. And we know that perfectly well from the recent electoral result, among other dynamics, right? But we also have to understand that that is connected to material pieces, right? There are always material privileges that could accrue as a result of that. Although often these are, for Du Bois, a little, overstated, and certainly illusory, in the sense that a lot of it's built on the idea among poor whites that they might one day be rich, right? In a general sense, Du Bois calls this, again, this is something we talked about, the American assumption. In other words, all poor people view themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, in the famous phrase, right? At some point, through work, through effort, through labor, they could become rich. And it's an incredibly powerful myth for keeping people within the system, right? Preventing them resisting it and fighting against it. We spoke of the fact that as a result of this distinction, this analysis of the wages of whiteness, this analysis of the corresponding American blind spot, what Du Bois refers to white supremacy as involving and creating, that in effect, he saw two labor movements in the US. One was the unionized labor movement, mostly in the North, of industrial workers, many migrant workers, many, particularly poor and oppressed, recent migrants. And the other labor movement for him was abolitionism, right? The movement that sought to abolish slavery. But both were imperfect and had their own blind spots that were really important for him. On the one hand, the labor movement in the North couldn't understand slavery as a form of labor, couldn't see it as anything, couldn't see individual enslaved people as anything but competition, misunderstood the fact that they were actually up against a system that hurt all workers and all laborers, and so couldn't see as potential forms of solidarity, couldn't see these forms of solidarity with enslaved people, right? But at the same time, for Du Bois, there's a blind spot that operates in the opposite direction, which is that many abolitionists who sought to abolish slavery were not thinking in more broadly labor-based terms, right? Many of them supported capitalism. Many of them saw the goal to abolish one form of exploitation without taking into account the fact that that would simply create new forms of exploitation, right? To pass from enslavement into wage labor is a promotion, but it's not the abolition of that kind of oppression, right? So you've got this mutual disconnect between these two labor movements that Du Bois is trying to map from the very beginning. And obviously, this is all incredibly important today. I mentioned previously that the relevance of some of the most important books that we read has a kind of tragic element to it, right? Like Du Bois would not want this book to be relevant today. Most third world revolutionary black Marxists and other revolutionaries do not want their work to continue to be relevant, because to be relevant means that the systems that they confront haven't been transformed or overthrown. And so you've got this paradoxical situation where things crop up again, things explode into the open as they did around 2016, for example, with the emergence of the Trump phenomenon, the emergence of more overt forms of white supremacy after the kind of numbing interlude of the Obama years, where people were acting as if race had been overcome, right? That we lived in a post-racial society. And if Trump and his ilk did anything for us, it was to remind us that that's clearly not true. And what we've seen since has been a far more conflictive, combative, and dynamic movement of these categories. But what happened around the emergence of Trump was that there were debates that some of you may remember, although it's now a while ago, with some people saying, oh no, it was just about class, right? It's just about people being poor. It's just about people having economic anxiety, and therefore they're voting for this right-wing populist who's openly white supremacist, openly misogynistic, transphobic, everything, right? Islamophobic. And then on the other side, though, you also have people who are saying it's just about racism. These people are and always have been racist, and therefore, there's no need to engage with this dynamic or understand it in any more profound way, right? And both of these really misunderstood the situation, and misunderstood specifically the way that race and class emerged and enter into kind of dynamic relationship, right? The fact that people who may be economically anxious and insecure, who have been abandoned, who are poor, who are suffering, who are dying of opioids, like the opioid epidemic in numbers approaching 1 million, right? We're talking about, crazy, crazy levels of disaffection, abandonment, and poverty. The question is, why did they become white supremacists? Why are they available to the far right? And the answers have a lot of pieces, right? Including media, hegemonic media outlets, right-wing talk radio, Joe Rogan, like all of these pieces, right? But the point is to understand that both of these pieces are operating. And Du Bois is telling us that this is nothing new. He's showing us that this story has long historical roots, and that there's an incredibly fraught relationship between race and class in this country, if that makes sense. That was kind of a long intro. But it's good because it really gets us to where we're at, right? Again, we've talked about the two primary classes that Du Bois is very concerned with, the black worker and the white worker. But he's going to round this out with this chapter that we're considering today, which is the chapter on the planter. In other words, a chapter on the planter class, the small class that holds power in the South before and into the period of the Civil War. And the class that actually really leads the South into war. And one of the main questions we're going to have reading through this chapter is, why does that occur? Was it inevitable? And what were the dynamics that brought this piece toward war? And again, for those who haven't been here before, we encourage people to begin and to pay a lot of attention to these chapter summaries right at the beginning. Every single word is chosen very carefully. And so here's the chapter summary for chapter 3 on the planter, right? How 7% of a section within a nation ruled 5 million white people and owned 4 million black people, and sought to make agriculture equal to industry through the rule of property without yielding political power or education to labor. It's like one of those things where you're like, oh, like you have a 50-word, word limit or something like that. And you're like, how can I say everything I can say by choosing only the words that matter, right? And by transitioning incredibly quickly through really powerful stuff. So again, 7% of a part of the country in power, seeking to make agriculture equal to industry through the rule of property without yielding political power or education to labor. So many pieces actually fully present here. And I actually want to begin with the very first word of the summary, right? Which is how. And I think that's key, right? Because Du Bois knows that that's the key question that has to be answered, which is precisely how. How could 7% of the US South govern? And he's pointing toward the material contradictions that, that lay this out. But the question is how. The question is, how does that small minority maintain its power? And it has everything to do with, as I'm sure people already know, it has everything to do with the poor whites. But the explanation in this context is not a simple one. He does say, this is right on the first page, that of the 5 million whites who own no slaves, some were united in interest with the slave owners. In other words, they had an actual economic interest in allying themselves with the slave owners. They were overseers, drivers, and dealers in slaves. This was a very small group, though, right? Those with an actual economic interest. And they formed what he refers to, again, using and stretching Marxist terms, a petty bourgeois class, climbing up to the planter class or falling down from it. But he says the mass of the poor whites were economic outcasts. Again, outcasts because they're literally excluded from a system that is based on slave labor, right? They're irrelevant to the Southern economy, except insofar as they can play a role as police, right? That's the relevance, right? Is this sort of political relevance. Now, how does the power of the planter manifest? How is it stabilized? How do you rule if you're only 7%? And that irony here, the deep irony, is that it's achieved through the consent, on the one hand, of certain sectors of the poor whites, but this system is built upon their disenfranchisement. This is a key point that Du Bois is trying to make. These economic outcasts are also political outcasts. The disenfranchisement of poor whites occurs through, on the one hand, property requirements to vote, and on the other hand, through literacy tests. In other words, this is running up to the Civil War, and actually these were sort of toned down a little bit prior to the Civil War, but for a long time, most poor whites couldn't vote at all, right? So they were being asked to uphold and support a system that not only did it not represent their class interests, but they couldn't even participate in, right? They were not even allowed to vote. And that's actually going to be a crucial piece when we move forward. Du Bois emphasizes this because for him, the US South had always been less democratic, right? It had always been less permeable to kind of democratic pressures. This is a period in which the democratic question emerges as, what do we do with these poor people? Are they allowed to vote? Should they not be allowed to participate? And the South had always, for him, been much more exclusionary through its reliance on these sort of property, these property eligibility requirements for voting and the literacy tests. But this was buttressed in a severe and an incredibly powerful way. It was exacerbated by an institution that many of us have heard of, but that we really need to think a little harder about how it operated, which is the 3/5 compromise, right? We've all heard about the 3/5 compromise. We've all learned about it in school. We all even hear it referenced often, but the way that it's often referenced is a fundamental misconception of what its goal was, what its function was, and why it was established, right? We tend fundamentally to interpret it along moral lines, ethical lines. This is not an aberration. We're told that we should interpret everything morally and ethically, and this has the convenient side effect of making us not focus on power and interest and economic dynamics, right? So what's happening on a moral level is we hear people saying something which is very true, which is that to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a human being is a moral underestimation of their value, right? They're not fully human, they're worth 3/5, right? They're underestimated. That is true in the way that it's framed, but it has almost nothing to do with the fact or the reason that was established, right? Because the 3/5 compromise was established as an overestimation, right? And an overestimation that served the power of the planters in the South. What does that mean? It means that if it were up to the North, for example, from the beginning, the US South would not be able to count enslaved people at all for its representation in Congress. Right? Why? Because they're not counted as citizens, they're not allowed to vote, they're not allowed to participate in political life. We shouldn't count them as, as part of the represented populace, right? The South wanted to have enslaved people represented 100%, right? And so that's where the kind of moral piece breaks down a little bit. That it was actually the planters who said, no, we want to count all of our enslaved people for the basis on which we are then represented in the National House of Representatives, because that will give us more power, right? It will inflate, and even the 3/5 compromise itself, which is the way that the two came to this agreement, overestimates the power of the planters. It inflates their power. It inflates their representation in Congress because they're still saying we represent this number of people, even though the majority of those people were not allowed to vote, either because they were poor whites or because they were enslaved, if that makes sense. On top of page 33, Du Bois makes this very clear. He says, into the hands of the slaveholders, the political power of the South was concentrated by their social prestige, by property ownership, and also by their extraordinary rule of the counting of all, or at least 3/5 of the Negroes as part of the basis of representation in the legislature. It is singular how this, quote, 3/5 compromise was used not only to degrade Negroes in theory, but in practice to disenfranchise the white South. This is really key for Du Bois. The 3/5 compromise was about weakening, diluting, and preventing poor whites from actually playing a bigger role in the power of the US South, right? It effectively gave this 7% political domination over a huge sector of the population without having the numbers to back that up, if that makes sense. So that's a key institution. A huge part of this chapter, as you've noticed, is about the planter as a class economically, but also about, and he spends actually a surprising amount of time, maybe for a Marxist, on this question of what planter culture looks like. What was the planter like as a person? What informed their beliefs, their understanding of the world, and why that matters, right? And it's incredibly important for him, not only because it's a symptom of the economic situation of the planter, which it is, but also because it has incredibly important consequences, right? It matters by the end of the chapter who the planter was. It matters what they thought, it matters what they believed, it matters what their outlook was, and that outlook actually is part of what traps them into the dead end of war. So it's incredibly important. In other words, again, general methodological piece, the economic factor is not determining everything. It's informing a culture that develops, and that culture creates consequences, right? Which are political, economic, social, and incredibly dramatic, right? So what is the culture of the planter? It is fundamentally decadent, right? It's about extravagance. It's about laziness. It's based on the performance of class power. It's what we could often understand as a sort of feudal or aristocratic culture, right? The Southern planter sought to generate wealth to consume that wealth, and we'll come back to that question. To put on extravagant displays, to have many of the sort of, what are they called? The like debutante balls and like the sort of, bizarre and anachronistic kind of mating rituals that are happening over here. On the other side, we have what Du Bois describes as sexual chaos, right? And this is informed by economic structure, right? He talks about the ways in which, and this is, full trigger warning around the ways that he talks about sexuality in this chapter. But the economic stimulus here is, for example, the abolition of the international slave trade, right? Creates a situation which we saw previously does not decrease the importance. It coincides with the profitability of cotton. So people want and need more slave labor in the US South. They're not allowed legally to import that slave labor. So it becomes more and more a question of reproduction, right? How can more slaves be produced? And how can that reproduction be stabilized? Right? This directly informs some incredibly, not only brutal and terrible things that we know, right? The forced reproduction of enslaved people, the forced use of enslaved women as essentially what he understands as brood mares. But it also leads directly into the sexual chaos of the plantation owners themselves, right? Who are sexually assaulting, enslaved women all the time, right? And something very, very peculiar is happening here, right? Which is that the normal rules of patriarchy say that your children follow the father's side in terms of their status, right? But the US South is one of the very strange exceptions where the decision is made because of this moment. Again, a moment in which slavery is incredibly important, in which enslaved people are incredibly valuable, and in which there need to be newer and more justifications for slavery, leading to a reinforcement of white supremacy and the racial binary. All of that creates a situation in which slave owners, are sacrificing the bloodline of their own children, right? And saying, no, they stay on the enslaved side. A, because they're valuable, and B, because we have this racial binary, the one drop rule, that has to keep them over there. Otherwise, the political system is threatened, right? If that makes sense. So you've got on the one hand this kind of feudal culture of elaborate displays of chastity and purity and governed sexuality for white women in particular. And then you've got the absolute sexual chaos for Du Bois, which is a system of abuse, a system of the sort of use, of slavery on a sexual level. And those are examples of the ways in which the economic structure is feeding into this chaos, right? And feeding into these kind of dynamics. The decadence and the laziness of slave owners is legendary, and it's also very transhistorical. People that read Hegel may know that in Hegel's sort of the foundation of German dialectical thought, Marx takes Hegel and turns it into a dialectic that involves an argument around the ways that the proletariat and oppressed class ultimately has power to overthrow and take over the reins of production. That's in some ways patterned and built on this master-slave dialectic of Hegel, which essentially talks about the ways in which slavery in its essence creates laziness, creates decadence, and creates the basis for its ultimate overthrow. And the way that Hegel makes the argument is very resonant, because he basically says, listen, you have enslaved this person, you put them to work, then you don't do anything, right? You are relaxing, you're kicking back, you're in a hammock, you've got a coconut with a straw in it, you're chilling, and you have no contact with the world, right? Meaning the real material world. You don't know how to do things, you lose that kind of contact. And ultimately the irony for Hegel and the inversion in his dialectic is to say the slave owner becomes the dependent party, right? Appears independent, appears powerful, sovereign, individual, but ultimately depends for his very relationship to the world on enslaved people, right? So there's a hidden weakness in there that Hegel is identifying, that Marx is taking into the economic realm, but that here is even more kind of literally true, because you've got an entire class of people who are absolutely detached from economic reality. They know what they're doing. The overseers who are governing it definitely know what they're doing, but they're ultimately existing in a condition of dependence. They're dependent on that labor, right? And they themselves are not able to replace it, which becomes very obvious very soon. Now, of course, what's very interesting in this, again, always happens, is that slave owners accuse enslaved people of being lazy, right? And we'll talk about the reasons for this. But on the one hand, it's clearly a projection, right, of their own decadence, their own laziness, their own extravagance. But he also has this very interesting line where he says that laziness was not racial, but economic. Not racial in the sense that it wasn't a biological sort of feature, as the slave owner tried to say, well, these people are lazy, it must be built into their biology. First of all, it's economic, because who the fuck would work for free when you're not being paid? And why would you work any harder than you needed to be, needed to work on an ultimate minimal level? And we'll come back to the actual powerful importance of that feature. But again, the laziness of the master is built into the economics of it too. Again, built into the material relationship, which is again a relationship of disconnect, of mediation with the world. They're not directly doing anything in the world. They're living off of the labor of others. All this leads Du Bois to a very interesting analysis and crucial passage about how slavery and the institution of slavery deforms not only its victims, but its perpetrators, fundamentally. And here, for me, the best reference point for comparison is always this incredible book, if you haven't read it, by Aimé Césaire, called The Discourse on Colonialism. And most of that book is actually about this, about how colonialism deforms the colonizer, right? And Césaire has this incredibly useful and powerful phrase when he says, no one colonizes innocently. If you're inflicting brutality, if you're engaged in this, not only this mediated relation of dependency on other people, but if that dependency requires the permanent, infliction of violence and brutality, but also the justification of it. Césaire emphasized this a lot, right? If you justify that brutality, you become less and less human in the process. Césaire is laser focused on this question of the impact on the colonizer. And again, this is hugely relevant for Israel and Palestine when you see the descent of Zionism into a form of absolute brutality that's ever more kind of open. A lot of people are reading Césaire to try to explain that. But Du Bois is making a very, very similar argument here about the sort of devastating impact. This is a little closer to the end of the chapter, but if people want to flip to like page 52, it's an important piece of this cultural analysis of who the slave master is. This is that book, A Discourse on Colonialism. Incredible. Introduction by Robin Kelly. Beautiful. This is on page 52. The Southern planter suffered, not simply for his economic mistakes. The psychological effect of slavery on him was fatal. The psychological effect of slavery on the master was fatal, right? The mere fact that a man could be under the law the actual master of the mind and body of human beings had to have disastrous effects. It tended to inflate the ego of most planters beyond all reason. They became arrogant, strutting, quarrelsome kinglets. I love that phrase, quarrelsome kinglets. Like not even kings, just these little petty sovereigns. Think cops, think prison guards, think white people, right? They issued commands, they made laws, they shouted their orders, they expected deference and self-abasement. They were choleric and easily insulted. Their honor, quotes, their honor became a vast and awful thing, requiring wide and insistent deference. Such of them as were inherently weak and inefficient were all the more easily angered, jealous, and resentful. I think we know this, right? Something to prove, you prove it through some kind of enforcement of your authority. While the few who were superior physically or mentally conceived no bounds to their power and personal prestige. As the world had long learned, nothing is so calculated to ruin human nature as absolute power over human beings, right? To be a master, particularly in the sense of owning another being and reducing them to non-existence or non-being, is absolutely fatal to the humanity of the master class, right? So this is who the slave owner is, right? This is who the planter is. This is how their culture develops. Again, there are general methodological pieces here, right? They didn't just have this culture, they developed it through a systemic practice, right? They weren't biologically, prone to this. It was built over time through an institution of power that taught them this, in which they had to justify, right? Again, thinking about the fact that the racial binary was relatively new in US history at this point. It had been a project to build and to create very quickly, right? It required new justifications. As the system becomes threatened, I think we've touched on this kind of paradox before, as the system becomes threatened, you have to justify it more. There's this sort of like paradoxical relationship here where the narratives around how happy slaves are increase, right? As it becomes clear that they aren't, right? As people are resisting more. So you have this sort of like very interesting contradiction. On an economic level, it's also very, very interesting because this created in the US South a relationship that prioritizes, in Du Bois's analysis, consumption over production, right? Southern slave owners produced to consume instead of consuming in order to produce. Does that make sense? And there's this like classic circuit of capitalism, right? Which is called MCM or MCM prime, which speaks to the ways in which as capitalism takes hold, the goal of economic production shifts from consumption toward the production of new wealth, right? The goal of capitalism is to create profit. You create that profit by accumulating wealth and reinvesting that wealth. The goal, in other words, is not, and this is part of what's so terrible about capitalism, the goal is not to produce things that people need to consume. The goal is to produce more wealth, right? This is the opposite, right? This is a circuit which begins with consumption, which moves through production just to get back to consumption, right? To accumulate wealth that you can then spend, again, elaborately, extravagantly, that you can spend on luxury goods. That's not what capitalists do, right? That's not what real capitalists do. We know, and we know that both of these are always happening. We know that capitalists are spending huge amounts of money. But what's very interesting is that the sort of, the kind of capitalist spirit, and Du Bois even uses this phrase, this is on page 37, he calls them hardworking, simple living zealots, right? Who saved and reinvested their profits. On the other hand, the planter, this is Du Bois' words, the planter wanted results without effort. Right? These are very different orientations toward the world. Again, of course, this system is integrated into global capitalism, but he's trying to identify very different kinds of economic culture, very different kinds of mindset, right? That again creates a contradiction for the planter in the South. And there's actually a really funny, commonality. It always strikes me as slightly funny. It's also shared by people like Marx and Engels themselves, who, when they're talking about capitalism, talk about how revolutionary it is, right? They describe it as revolutionary, and it always seems ironic because they don't mean it as a compliment, but they mean that capitalism has this internal competitive dynamic that is always amplifying, speeding up, revolutionizing, transforming, tearing down things in incredibly brutal ways. But you have this situation where you have a lot of people. Fanon does something very similar because he's looking at the sort of elites in in so-called third world countries and colonized countries, and he said, like, they're not capitalists. They're not producing anything. They're not reinvesting. They're actually very much geared toward a very different kind of mindset. And it's not a compliment to be a capitalist, right? But they're identifying the fact that this sort of sheer laziness that's produced by these systems is a very different kind of frame. So Du Bois is showing that they're among other things, that capitalism includes race, that it includes relations of production that Marx would have associated with different phases of history, right? For basic Marxism, history moves from like slave relations to a slave mode of production, to a feudal mode of production, to a capitalist mode of production, and in showing the way that, again, just in the U.S. South, all of these are kind of existing. There's this kind of feudal class that's upholding relations of production that are characteristic of slavery, all for the benefit of global capitalism as a broader system. He's troubling the idea that we have just this one singular mode of production, right? We talk about this a lot at Abolition School. We live under capitalism, we know that, but it's not this sort of simple thing, right? It's an incredibly uneven thing, to use the phrase of Walter Rodney, right? It looks very different in different parts of the world, and it sort of translates differently into practice. So Du Bois is, in a way, showing the simultaneity of all these different relations, that they all coexist. But he nevertheless, this is on page 37, he does uphold some kind of idea of a kind of historical progression when he says, and he speaks of and describes slavery as, quote, the economic lag of the 16th century carried over into the 19th century, right? So he is, in a certain way, seeing it as slightly outdated, or very outdated, right? Toward the end of the chapter, he, if people have probably noticed the phrase, he says, if it had not committed suicide in civil war, it would have disintegrated of its own weight, right? All of these systems exist and coexist and are capable of coexisting under global capitalism, but it was still an outdated form. It was still not a particularly profitable or efficient form, let's put it that way. It's massively profitable, but we'll get into the reasons why it was less and less efficient, right? And the contradictions that this puts the planter into. This backwardness, this so-called backwardness of slavery as a mode of production, again, I use the word mode in a very hesitant way, as the predominant relation that prevails in the U.S. South, is an economic relation, obviously, but it also, the backwardness that Du Bois is identifying has its psychological elements, which help push the South towards civil war. Again, I keep trying to describe it before we get into the meat of it. And so the question is, how do the economic contradictions that emerge and the psychology that they produce create a situation in which the Southern planter could not get out, right? Or as we'll get to it at the end, the way Du Bois sees it is, in theory, the planter could have gotten out of this, but the planter was not the kind of person who could have gotten out of this. This is a very classic example of the Marxist, analysis, which says, listen, like we don't, we make our own history, but we're also made by that history. Right? We're produced as products of those historical structures. We can act in certain ways, but the ways we act are many ways not dictated, but influenced by, subject to the ways that we ourselves are produced. Right? So the contradiction, right? First, the first piece of the contradiction is that the North controls capital. The North represents capital. It also controls, as a result, shipping. It controls the banks. What does this mean for the Southern economy? It means that the South has very little control. They're producing huge amounts of cotton, which are then sold on the market, making them incredibly rich in a certain way, but they don't actually control all of the conditions of that. Part of the delusion of the South is that they do, right? They think they're in control of this system. They think that they have a far broader scope of control than they actually have, right? They don't set the price of cotton. That's set on the global market. They don't profit from the financialization of cotton. That profit is going into the North, right? The North is getting wealthier and wealthier off of this system, and actually benefiting from, the system at least as much as the Southern planters. And it's got the South has this delusion of grandeur that prevents the recognition of this. Second, in this context, right, in which they don't control the price, the only way to increase profit is to retaliate, as Du Bois puts it. He could retaliate only by more ruthlessly exploiting his slave labor so as to get the largest crops at the least expense, right? The pressure point the planter has is on enslaved people. Get them to work harder. That's all they can do, right? Or as he puts it on page 41, beat down the cost of his slave labor. Force enslaved people to work harder to produce more, right? In the background of this, there's something important, which is the declining yield of the land, right? The more you grow over and over and over again, you're still growing cotton, but the yield is getting lower and lower. We'll return to the question of new land that would have a higher yield in a moment. But the only leverage point, again, that the planter has is to beat down that labor and make it work harder and harder and harder. There's a contradiction here, right? And there's a contradiction that's specifically built into slavery, right? Which ironically, again, I say ironically, because it poses as a system of absolute labor discipline, right? If you think slavery, you think full, total, violent discipline of the worker, right? But slavery ironically poses and contains internal challenges to that discipline that are very important to understand. It's because it's a system that relies on violence that it relies only on violence, right? And violence is really one of the only mechanisms that it can use. We see the way that it uses ideology, that it uses, all these myths, right? It says enslaved people are happy. It says the slave master is the patriarchal father of his big. People don't buy that shit, right? Like actual enslaved people, for the most part, know that this system rests on force, and they know that because if they do anything else, they see force, right? So it's fundamentally a system that doesn't rest on what we often call in abolition school hegemony. It rests on brute force, right? Again, Fanon is a good parallel to this. He says, listen, in the global South, or in this case, in the South of the North, violence rules, right? In the global core, in Europe, in the US, hegemony, ideas, the common sense, plays a much bigger role. But where people are being dominated and exploited on this level, it's force only that rules, right? Here's the contradiction. Under wage labor in industrial capitalism, workers can be disciplined through the wage and through employment. They can be fired. Ironically, that doesn't exist. That leverage doesn't exist, right? Slavery lacks that leverage point, right? People can also escape, right? The negative attitude of the general strike, as Du Bois puts it. We'll talk about the general strike next week, but it's grounded in the very fact that people can leave, right? People can escape. It's not easy to do, but it's something that can be done, the escape from labor as a permanent threat. But here again, we come to this question of the so-called laziness of enslaved people, right? Which is, again, it makes perfect sense. It gets built into a biological justification and explanation by the slave owner. But if you go to page 40, Du Bois says very clearly, they might be made to work continuously, but no power could make them work well. This is an incredibly powerful phrase, right? You can try to force enslaved people to work harder and harder and harder, but that's about all you can try to do, right? And no force can make them work well. On top of that, there's this ultimate limit, right? If all you have is violence to coerce someone, and the ultimate limit point of that violence is the death of that worker, right? But you have created a system, again, this is a contradiction of capitalism, you've created a system that relies on that labor, so you can't destroy that labor too much, right? And again, in this context, which was a context in which the abolition of the international slave trade creates a situation in which there's a great deal of effort put on maintaining and retaining this kind of labor, it's an incredibly ironic contradiction for this brutal and violent slave master to not actually be able to force someone to work well, right? As soon as the overseer turns their back, people do what they want, right? There's this sort of permanent and constant trajectory and tendency towards sabotage that weakens that production, and there is no other way to enforce it. So the planter is caught in this really important contradiction. And the psychological piece is really crucial for Du Bois. As I said, they could have grasped this contradiction, right? They could have stepped outside of who they were and thought about the fact that they exist in a certain relationship to industrial capital in the North. They need to, say, modernize. What this would have looked like for Du Bois would have been the South voluntarily abolishing slavery, embracing wage labor, and using that to maintain their power in a far more rational and systematic and profitable way in the long run, right? But the planter could not do that, right? Instead, it turns to racist pseudoscience to uphold the system, to inflate their own egos, as we've seen, to inflate their understanding of their importance in the global economic system. They say everything needs this cotton, therefore we're the most important piece, which wasn't ultimately true. And they were just ultimately, for Du Bois, too willfully ignorant. They were too lazy. They were too embedded within this system that they couldn't imagine anything outside of it. And fundamental in this is the fact that their political power relied on this, again, thanks to the 3/5 compromise. Again, moving toward wage labor would mean sacrificing that overrepresentation. It would mean incorporating more people into the political system, specifically poor whites, who could counterbalance that, that kind of power. And so there's this fear built in that without slavery, the power of this planter class would dissipate, right? So they couldn't foresee its abolition, and they couldn't empower poor whites without knowing that those poor whites would want to eliminate the system of slavery as well. Now, there was one last option, right? If they couldn't get more work out of enslaved people, and if they couldn't voluntarily abolish slavery, the planters' last option was to add more land to the labor supply, right? Again, this economic contradiction we see here creating the very direct and very obvious political flashpoint of the Civil War, right? Which is the attempted westward expansion of the slave system. We talked, previously about how, Bleeding Kansas, the Free Soil movement, about the contradictions of resistance to the westward movement of slavery. So you've got essentially planters trying to move westward. That means new land that's more proportionally productive, right? That would give more profits more quickly, right? You apply your enslaved people to new land, and you could make more money. You expand that land, and you expand your political representation in the process. That is what the North couldn't accept, namely more states that would be demanding and claiming representation in federal government. That was unacceptable. And you had the Free Soil movement, which was about keeping slavery out of the West, but for two different reasons, if we remember, right? One was you're against the system of slavery. Another, though, is that you actually want no black people moving west either, right? That was built on, again, on the misunderstanding that it was the individuals that you were, as a white person, that you were sort of in competition with. But on top of westward expansion, there's a very important piece that Du Bois opens up here. And it's going to be really important for how we understand the book in general. If you look on page 41, but then into 42, when he's talking about this expansion, when he's talking about other spaces, he says, first toward the northwestern territories of the US, then toward the West Indian Islands in South America. The South was drawn toward the West by two motives. First, the possibility of slavery, and second, to prevent the expansion of free labor. But then if you skip a little further down, the radical South expected defeat in the West and hoped the consequent resentment among slaveholders would set the South toward a great slave empire in the Caribbean. Jefferson Davis was ready to reopen the African slave trade to any future acquisition south of the Rio Grande. Sorry, this is on 42 toward the top. Now, it may not be super obvious why this matters, but it's because we're talking about a transnational imperial project, right? Again, this is not a book just about the US. The conclusion of the book is a global conclusion. In the first chapter, he foregrounds that he's talking about the dark proletariat of the global South as a whole, right? And he's talking about the connection between this struggle within the US and global imperialism. He's writing in a moment of global imperialism, looking back at a moment in which he sees the defeat of Reconstruction as central for opening that up, right? And it's already built into the arguments of the slave system, right? Which is that the Confederacy, the project of the Confederacy, was not just slavery in the US South, it was to recreate a slave empire in the Caribbean. It was a transnational project. That's incredibly important to understand. Yeah. 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 Actually, what we can also do is take some, because we have been trying to take a couple of questions. But do we want to take a couple of questions now, or? Yeah, we can take a couple of questions and let people think through and process. There's only a couple more things to say, and then we can go to more substantive, broader questions. But we can take a good chunk of questions right now. We've got, again, the way that this operates is that we've got people on the stream who are going to be listening and asking questions. And then, we're also going to incorporate questions back and forth that DJ will help us manage. Do folks in the room have specific questions?
I just had a question from the first slide when it was talking about the 3/5 compromise. I feel like that would create. Did that create some really perverse incentives from an economic standpoint? Like it would incentivize them to overproduce. You know what I mean? Have more slaves, overproduce slaves to increase their political representation, but also would that devalue the slave labor because there's so much more of it, and you also have to maintain that slave labor. I know it's pretty bleak, but I just can't,
No, sure. I mean, the whole incentive structure of the U.S. South is perverse.
Yeah,
we should be clear about that. It's all based on brutality. But I think the clearer incentive is the actual labor itself, right? What happens, of course, is that as the value of cotton increases, the value of individual, slaves also shoots up, right? Again, there's this permanent and constant process of smuggling of other pieces, but there are different moments in which historically the emphasis becomes on the sort of domestic reproduction of enslaved people, and then the sale in other moments. So I think the incentive is primarily that. I don't think there was it's far more valuable the individual enslaved person than the sort of theoretical representation that might add, right? It's just to think about the broader frame, right, which is to say that this was an overrepresentation. Again, the slave owners wanted in an even higher overrepresentation that would inflate their power, right? And again, we haven't really gotten to talking about the relationship with the North, but this is the conflict, right? Which is if the South is overrepresented, it has a majority in the federal legislature, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. That majority allows the agricultural slave-owning South to set policy, right? We know about what it means to be on this sort of razor's edge. that kind of tension, picture that overlaid with the fundamental questions over how the system would operate, right? Again, these are not moral questions for most people in the North. They're not fundamentally ethically opposed to slavery, but they are opposed to a system in which their economic interests would be dictated by the planters in the South.
Let me make sure this is on. Okay. We have a question on the chat that says that Du Bois talks about the planter class, which constituted 7% of the population, yet owned roughly 75% of the slaves. The remaining people who owns the other 25% seem significant, yet aren't really touched on. Why?
Sorry, the main people that own what?
Yeah. So the question from the chat, this is really distracting me.
Just the last part, the main people that own.
Yeah, so planters own 7% of the population, with 7% of the population, yet own 75% of the slaves. The remaining people who own the other 25% seem significant, yet aren't really touched on. Why?
Yeah, no, I think that's true, right? Du Bois is saying, you're talking about the fact that 7% owns 75% of enslaved people. But it's important, right? It's incredibly important. What that looks like is the smaller slave owners, essentially, who are, for Du Bois, symbolically overrepresented. And he says the South describes itself as a bunch of people who own small numbers of slaves, right? And he says, no, we're talking about a small number of people who have concentrated huge amounts of land and huge amounts of human beings under their control, right? So part of what he's saying is that, no, actually, that's what matters, right, is the 75%, right? They're the ones, we could think of something similar about the rich and the ultra rich, or whatever we want to talk about, right? Who really matters, who really represents, the political power structure. That's part of what he's saying, right? It would be worth paying attention to the political dynamics that these other pieces sort of bring about. But here you have a dynamic that's very familiar, again, with capitalism, of concentration. Whereas in these moments of pressure, in these moments of profit squeezing, essentially, these smaller landowners are the ones who are struggling for profitability, right? Often, losing that land, it's getting, picked up by a larger kind of landowner. I mean, so I think there are things that sort of tease out there, but he's really concerned with the power structure. Right? What else do folks want to ask? Do we have, there's one over here, or a couple actually. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just had a quick definition question. I'd heard you kind of hesitate to describe slavery as a mode of production, but you had called it a relation, and I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around that a little bit. So slavery is not and I guess I'm understanding the South is clinging to this method of production that is not based upon increasing capital and not producing to produce more. It's just to feed its own wealth, whereas the North is markedly has control of capital and is utilizing wage workers to that end. So I'm curious about that distinction.
Yeah, no, and it's one that, again, I struggle with, that we struggle with a bit at abolition school, because it's and in a lot of, again, it's the question and the struggle is very characteristic of third world Marxism, right? Which does several things, but starts with saying, here's what Marx said about the world, here's what our reality looks like, how do these connect or disconnect, right? And how can we then deploy Marxist categories and transform them, as Du Bois is doing in the process of deploying them, right? So Marx would say capitalism is defined by wage labor versus the bourgeoisie. Those are the main classes of society. If capitalism in England in the 19th century is what you understand as capitalism, that's true. If capitalism is a global system, that's not true, right? Because you have different, again, relations means how is production arranged, right? Which can be the localized manifestation of that, right? There are many places in which across the globe, wage labor is not predominant, right? The majority of workers on this globe today are not wage laborers, right? And yet, you have this question of how then do we understand the overarching mode? So you've got relations, and then this claim that in certain historical moments or certain places, there's a mode that is the predominant form. One of the ways that Marxism has gotten around this that's incorrect and not very useful is to act as if capitalism has a telos, right? It leads in a certain direction, and that direction is toward wage labor as the fundamental mode, right? which is to say, even if those all coexist, capitalism produces wage laborers and capitalists. Again, it doesn't do that on a global level. Capitalism in the US does not produce wage labor in Peru. It produces dispossession, it produces, disenfranchisement, it produces feudalism, it produces slavery, because its concern with the global south is to extract resources and to dump goods ultimately into those markets, right? So there's this difficulty, right? Again, this is what like Amilcar Cabral and Walter Rodney and Jose Carlos Mariátegui and Fanon all struggle with, which is like, how do we adapt these, by deploying them? And what you see is people deploy things like class analysis, right? They say, we're trying to analyze the class structure of society. Where does that lead us? So that's a Marxist thing to do, but it leads beyond the sort of limitations of what's often understood. I don't have a real good answer on the mode piece, right? Which is, again, I think people like Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa struggle with it. And he says things like imperialism in the service of capitalism, or he says capitalist slavery. He'll use a phrase like capitalist slavery. And what's very interesting about capitalist slavery is that it's different from historical slavery that Marx is talking about, which is generally non-racial, right? Which is generally operates under a very different framework. When slavery then gets tethered to capitalism, it becomes racial and it becomes something different. It operates in a different kind of way, right? If that makes sense. Just like when agriculture gets tethered to capitalism, it starts to operate differently. Workers are proletarianized across the countryside in a way that they weren't previously. So, yeah. Huge question.
So we have a question from chat that says, although absent from Du Bois' discussion, in what ways did slavery land on indigenous people during this time?
Yeah. In what ways does it land? Incredibly harshly. Yeah. We've talked a little bit, I think, about Bacon's Rebellion, right? Which is this historical moment that's understood as one of the real motivations behind the racial binary. 1670s, black workers, white workers get together and they rise up and almost overthrow the planters, right? Planters get scared and then they say, oh, you know what? Here's one thing we can do that's very important, right? We can say indentured/slavery labor is inherently for black people and white people do free wage labor, right? We distinguish them, we keep them apart from each other, we divide up their struggles, we subject them to different conditions. So this resistance and this rebellion against the planters motivates a new attempt to impose a racial binary, enforce that racial binary and divide workers, right? That is an important story, but it's an incomplete story because one thing that those black and white indentured laborers were demanding was more access to land, which in many cases meant, not even implicitly, meant very obviously the displacement of indigenous people, right? It meant the justification to move west, right? For people that, people probably know this about US history, but there were extensive periods in which it was not legal to move west, right? But it was legal, like in the sense that you could move west, and this is just it's like a vigilante logic. Like you just go out and do it, and then the government would ultimately back you in the sort of conflicts that emerge, right? So you've got this sort of settler logic underpinning these labor demands, which is really important, right? And you've also got contradictory logics here that are, I think, always easy to forget, which is that capitalist and most forms of labor require and need some kind of containment, right? If all workers could simply move west and claim free land, then no one would have any kind of labor discipline on the eastern seaboard, right? If that makes sense. This is why enslavement has a spatial character, right? This is why you're required to stay on the plantation, right? And that's why part of why it's useful, right? This is why after abolition, and we'll see this, one of the main forms of control was control of movement, right? Vagrancy laws. You had to have a job. You couldn't be moving freely. These are for free people, right? So-called free people. Why? Because they were very concerned that people wouldn't stay and work, right? So there needs to be this kind of compression. There's this attempt to keep people to work. There's this desire by workers themselves to move west, right? And that moving west is always about expanding the sort of genocidal project, right? Again, that doesn't mean it was always a conscious thing or an explicit thing, but the background for this has to be understood, right? And the absence of it in the story, again, is something that we talk about pretty regularly. Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't remember if we went over this at any point, but was there like a specific reason that slavery didn't permeate into the factory like working system of the North, or
Mhm.
was it solely like the labor movement that outlawed slavery in the North, or was there like an ulterior motive that had happened?
Mhm. I mean, it's a good question. It's a historical question, right? And it coincides with the question of like, of more, when did industry emerge and what were the conditions of it, right? Wage labor is already emerging in Europe, right? Again, we don't want to understand these as separate phenomena because slavery is incredibly central to the global economy. Again, prior to this moment that Du Bois is talking about, again, the mid 1800s, the 19th century. When the French Revolution happens, it happens in large part, as CLR James shows, because of the massive profits coming from what is now known as Haiti, right? A sugar colony. That money is getting plowed into the capitalist system, reinforcing the power, the sort of demand for power by the wealthy bourgeoisie that are developing it, right? So they're interlocked, we know that. But wage labor is already something that exists, right? Wage labor is already something that's predominating on the northern seaboard. Part of the historical reason is that these were not large centers of the slave trade, right? There was not a systematic attempt to import huge numbers to work in northern factories, and it was part of that is based on the sort of understandings and interpretations of what the agricultural needs were, right? I mean, not the agricultural needs, I should say, but the interpretation built into this sort of framework was that slavery was suited to basic agriculture, right? It wasn't suited to even working in factories, something so complex as working in factories. There's a racial logic that's kind of built into that kind of already, if that makes sense. And it becomes the predominant form, and then it becomes an incredibly efficient and effective form. And it's fueled by, and this is what you see in the first couple of chapters, huge waves of migration from Europe, right? And we pointed out the kind of ironic economic circuit here, right? Which is that slavery in the US South is accelerating and speeding up the development of global capitalism and the profits that it's making. And that is driving migrants to leave Europe through the immiseration of the proletariat. They're moving to the US, they're trying to integrate into this system, they're becoming sort of migrant workers in the US, and it's all part of this sort of circuit that slavery is at the heart of, if that makes sense. Cool. Yeah. So we've got the question of the contradictions, right? We've raised the economic contradiction the planter's in. We've raised the ways in which this is the wrong class to lead the South out of that contradiction, if that makes sense. Again, they didn't understand very well their own position. They were too willfully ignorant, again, didn't want to understand. They didn't foresee the possibility of abolishing slavery voluntarily, and they were very, very concerned to push back on the encroaching power, as they perceived it, of the North. And again, this leads us to the outbreak of war, right? Each of these three chapters, he's kind of like priming us up toward the actual sort of tipping point. And what Du Bois identifies is very interesting, right? Which is three rough causes of the actual moment of crisis. Again, these are tensions that are building, these are pressures that are building up. The first is, what he understands as is Lincoln's election, right? And election not on, I don't even know if this needs to be said in this room, but Lincoln is not elected to abolish slavery. Lincoln doesn't actually want to abolish slavery until very, very late in the game, which we'll talk about ad nauseum. But he was not elected on that. He was elected on the limitation of the expansion of slavery westward and of the power of slave states, right? So that's something the South, of course, hates, but that's often given as the primary factor. Du Bois says no. Second primary factor is the size of the cotton crop, right? In 1859, and this is it's a little hard to grasp, but the point here is that it wasn't that the cotton crop was small or low, or that it created more sort of like pressure on the slave owner, despite the sort of creeping contradiction that we've been talking about. What happens is that there's actually a huge bumper crop of cotton, right? This creates, again, it feeds into this kind of delusion whereby the South thinks that it can just go it alone, right? So we're talking about secession, we're talking about the US South saying, listen, we can just leave and do fine on our own, and that's because of this huge bumper crop of cotton in part. The third piece that Du Bois emphasizes was John Brown, right? And as a crystallization of what it meant to, in a militant way, provoke a moral and military and political crisis for slavery, right? 1859, for people that know, just down the road at Harper's Ferry, John Brown and others lead an attack which ultimately fails, but which succeeds in its failure, right? The attack on Harper's Ferry was, again, this happens all the time, a military failure, social and political victory in the long run, which is to say it sets off a chain reaction which helps to doom slavery. John Brown died. This is a very, Hegel would see this as like this profoundly Hegelian sort of like historical lesson, which is that John Brown sacrifices his life, and in the course of that, his work is done, right? In the course of that, he's contributing to this cause. That's way too determinist, but it's one of these pieces that, that Du Bois is identifying as provoking a crisis, right? So the war breaks out because of this secession caused by these anxieties in the South, the economic contradiction, their inability to kind of see their way out of it. And, and that's where we'll start in some senses next week with the general strike. But it's worth looking at the last, again, we always say when you're reading Du Bois, like you read the very first passages and then read the very last passages of the chapter, and you read anywhere where he starts to sort of speak in poetic or prophetic terms. This is where at the bottom of 53 you have the phrase, if it had not committed suicide in civil war, it would have disintegrated of its own weight. But on the next page, he says something very peculiar, which has always interested me, and I'm sort of just like full disclosure, I don't fully ever understand it any of the times that I've read this book, where he says, with the Civil War, or it's not that I don't understand it, I don't understand the importance of it fully, but you can help me. With the Civil War, the planters died as a class. We still talk as though the dominant social class in the South persisted after the war, but it did not, it disappeared. Just how quickly and in what manner the transformation was made, we do not know. No scientific study of the submergence of the remainder of the planter class into the ranks of poor whites and the corresponding rise of a portion of the poor whites into the dominant portion of landholders and capitalists has been made. And he goes through and says most of the names of the planters after the war are not the same names of the planters prior to the war. The disaster of war decimated the planters. The bitter disappointment and frustration led to a tremendous mortality after the war. And from 1870 on, the planter class merged their blood so completely with the rising poor whites that they disappeared as a separate aristocracy. It is this that explains so many characteristics of the post-war South: its lynching and mob law, its murders and cruelty, its insensibility to the finer things of civilization. What a fucking weird thing to say at the end of this chapter, right? So he's saying a couple of things. One peculiarity is the fact that we know that the arc of this story is that the domination of the planter class continues after the war. It seems like part of what he's saying is that those specific planters disappeared, other planters rose up and acquired a position of dominance, which is why I said, you can tell what he's saying, I don't know why that matters, right? Even weirder is the explanation of why it matters, right? Which is to say, it explains so many of the characteristics of the post-war South. But then what he offers are these bizarre cultural symptoms, right? I mean, again, it's not all cultural, right? He's saying that lynching and mob law is anchored in this new poor white class that rose into power, right? He's saying that the weirdest part is the insensibility to the finer things of civilization. As though he himself, Du Bois, believed in the kind of feudal, elegant myth that the US South told about itself, which he doesn't, right? So he's like somewhere in between being sarcastic, of course, very sarcastic about the finer things of civilization, but in some ways dead serious about something that's different, and specifically how that manifests as a different kind of murder, right? A different kind of cruelty, a more openly brutal kind of vigilante violence, right? we'll see that this is, of course, a simplification, that when he maps the modes that slavery operated in the different states, in the different regions of the Confederacy in the South, you see very, very different dynamics. He even admits that there are places, in the sort of heart of the South, in Virginia and elsewhere, where there was more of a patriarchal kind of family kind of structure, and then there were vast factory-style plantations down the river, right? And these all coexisted. So part of the question that I want to leave you all with is this question of what exactly he's trying to do here. Does it really explain the difference in the different kinds of violence that emerge in the aftermath? Does it really explain the rise of lynching? Does it really explain the rise of sort of mob violence? It just seems like such a peculiar chapter. But just before we go fully, into the rest of your questions, I just want you all to think a little bit as we move toward next week, right? Which is a chapter on the general strike. Absolutely fucking essential, amazing chapter, an incredibly important contribution, that Du Bois is making. We've got this class constellation that says black worker, white worker, planter, like a rough sort of like constellation of the classes that are going to matter a lot into this dynamic. And the next chapter is how he sets that dynamic into motion, right? How that class constellation begins to sort of move, the kind of struggles that it unleashes. And as we read it, I want to ask you all to pay close attention to the question of meaning, right? Meaning. Not only what does Du Bois himself mean, right, which is also, often fraught, as we're seeing in this piece, but also his analysis of why meaning shifts and who is in power of that shift, right? Who drives that transformation? And just to sort of foreground, if you look at the summary of the general strike chapter, he says how the Civil War meant emancipation. And one of the questions is, how does it come to mean emancipation? Because we've already said that it didn't mean that, right? It didn't mean it for the South. It didn't mean it for the North. Who does it mean that for? How does that meaning become the predominant one? So that's what we're going to talk about next week, the general strike. Don't miss it. For now, though, let's have whatever questions folks online or in the room have about this chapter on the planter. I think there's one in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. Do I have to touch anything? Hello. Okay, I have a question on what you're just saying, Gio, about the end of that chapter. I guess I'm wondering, is it oversimplifying like that question that you're having of why is he talking about the planter? Like, why is it so important that the planter has joined forces with the poor whites and saying like the details of the lynching and the mob riots, mob violence? Like, is it oversimplifying to say that because it was inevitable that the planter class has lost their power because they lost it? That's what they're saying in that war. They had no choice. They lost it. In now they have no choice but to join with the poor whites because they have created this system of white supremacy. They've created the concept of whiteness, and they now have no choice but to be equalized with poor whites. And so now, and poor whites now have access to the power that, like, of course they're going to take it because they were taking it before with the KKK, when they finally had access to it, but they were awarded it before. So now you have this concept of whiteness that is like officially etched into stone, and the class differences are starting to like be pushed together because poor whites now, like the planters have no choice but to come with the poor whites if they still want to have any power, because the planter class is starting to disappear, or at least the old planters are starting to lose the power that they had.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, right? And I think part of what's so confusing to me is that he doesn't mean that there's much more equality, right? In a certain sense. I think if you look at the numbers, I would be super curious. I think there's probably, it becomes like more than 7%, right? That's owning 75% of the resources. But it's not, he's not speaking to an actual equalization. He's on some level talking about a replacement, right? Like certain planters lost power, certain poor whites rose up and gained power through ruthlessness, violence, whatever else. That's why I raised the question of like, does it matter? But I think part of what you're pointing to is really important, right? Which is the ways in which the arrangement of power had to be transformed, right? The incorporation of the poor whites into the power structure had to look different, right? And we don't want to give it too much credit because it doesn't mean that they're on an economic par with the planters. They're still incredibly oppressed. They become the sharecroppers of the future as well, right? They're displaced in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery. Poor whites and former slaves are displaced westward by sharecropping and sort of debt peonage. So they're all subject to this, but then, again, the question of why does it matter? And then the peculiar answer that it rests a little bit on culture, right? And I think part of what I find disconcerting is the suggestion that these new poor whites who become the planters after the Civil War are somehow more violent, right? Or more brutal. And I don't know what the basis is for that. I don't know. So part of me is like, I think the historical emergence of lynching is not because of who is in power in the US South, right? It's not because they've like lost their kind of aristocratic heirs, right? I think it's because lynching only makes sense after the abolition of slavery, right? Do you know what I mean? Like there was, of course, small amounts of lynching under and to uphold the discipline of the slave system, but lynching as an extra state form of violence doesn't make sense under a slave system where violence by slave masters on their sort of enslaved sort of like chattel is not a crime, is not understood to be something outside of the law. Do you know what I mean? Like in that sense, lynching doesn't make sense until after. So I don't fully understand, what it is that he's trying to get at, right? Lynching seems to me to be a historical form of the disciplining of Black and white labor and of women, like all of that is happening at once by lynching, like through lynching, and of course of sort of Mexican, and indigenous populations. But again, it's a historic form that emerges necessarily in some ways after, and then prior to mass incarceration and policing, right? Mass incarceration and policing bring lynching into the state, right? So it strikes me as something that only exists in that period. So I'm still struggling with it a little bit, but yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Again, I'm not sure why. Like why it matters outside of the specificity of those forms, if that makes sense, right? And again, it's important pointing out that underlying all of this is this sort of permanent dynamic in U.S. history, which is that any move toward Black freedom means violence, right? It means new reactions to try to contain it, right? So they're thinking specifically about like lynching being a reaction to the perceived breakdown of the boundaries between communities, the threats of miscegenation, the claims about sex and sexual violence that that go hand in hand with lynching, right? That are used to uphold and justify it, are anxieties, right? Anxieties about breakdown, anxieties about mobility and boundary crossing. Yeah.
Yeah, so another question that we have from the chat is, was there tension between the already established Caribbean planter class and U.S. planters who wanted to expand into the Caribbean at the time?
That's a great question. And I think there may be, I'm trying to think of whether there's anything that would counteract it. No. I mean, I think the reality is that we're talking about roughly different historical moments, right? The planter class that exists in the Caribbean, yes, 100%, right? Or, I mean, we're not so much talking about the expansion of U.S. planters into and taking over territory, but about the idea of forming an alliance or an expansion of slave states, slave republics that could be then, a part of this broader system. Again, I want to underline the fact that the centrality of slavery in the Caribbean was on the decline through the abolition, but that abolition was also, underwritten by economic inefficiency, the perception that slavery was not sort of the mode that was going to sort of carry these systems forward. Of course, there was always a class that was willing to have a go at it, right? Haiti was off limits at this point, but other islands and other parts of the Caribbean could be brought into that sway. But yeah, I don't think it was so much a competition as the fact that on the one hand, there's a historical disjuncture between the fact that, I mean, if we're talking about Haiti, like those planters were chased away or thankfully taken care of in the correct way. But, you know, many of them ended up in the US South, right? Like they landed in the US South, they brought, you know, they landed in New Orleans, right? A lot of what's going to happen when we talk about the Louisiana chapter has a lot to do with these kinds of, you know, kind of Caribbean connections. But yeah, I think it's both of those pieces, right? That there's not a direct competition because of historical disjuncture, and because it's not so much a question of taking over as it is of building, rebuilding, right? And there are lots of attempts to rebuild sort of absolutist, you know, dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The French invasion of Mexico is another one to rebuild a Catholic absolute monarchy. And there are all these sort of like simultaneous attempts to do that. What else?
Any questions from the in-person?
Cool.
Another question from the chat is someone from the chat says, would love to hear Gio talk more about how he understands this chapter is relevant to global politics today, particularly with the rise/reemergence of fascism across the US and Europe.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The relevance of this chapter, I mean, this chapter is like, would seem to be less relevant, right? Because we're talking about a class that is losing power, even in the moment that Du Bois is talking about it, right? We're talking about a class that isn't maybe the predominant base. But what's essential to this chapter, of course, is the completion of the kind of circuit of the wages of whiteness, right? The circuit of the building of this, what will be a cross-class alliance, right, of whiteness, right? The consolidation of that power, right? And so that's what the planter is struggling with. One of the very interesting things that we'll see in the playing out of the actual Reconstruction governments in different states is that Du Bois is mapping out in all these states, well, how big is the Black population? How conscious are they? How organized are they? To what degree are they able to establish a sort of dominant bloc in this government? And the other variables in the equation are always this permanent antagonism of poor whites toward the planter class, right? And to what degree they're able to offset each other. Because there's places where the poor whites are kind of overthrowing or threatening to overthrow the planter class. There are places under Reconstruction where the poor whites are the majority, and so they're using Reconstruction law. And a big piece of Reconstruction law is the disenfranchisement of Confederates, right? So poor whites in some states are saying, oh yeah, we support that. Like, let's exclude high-ranking Confederates from the entirety of the political system, because that means getting rid of the planter class, right? And that then the poor whites themselves would be able to sort of substitute, play a substitute role. So there are very, very interesting dynamics that are playing out there. That's off the topic of the relevance for today. But I mean, the relevance, largely lay in how this cross-class alliance is established, right? How it relates to the long-term structure of power in the United States, how the relationship between land and whiteness is established and reestablished and consolidated. So I think there's a lot here. And the contradictions of ideology, right? The stubbornness of this kind of ideology that seeks to justify and uphold a kind of retrograde system. Again, of course, we live in a moment in which these are not just historical references, right? We're talking about neo-Confederates walking around. And so one of the questions we need to ask is, what are the neo-Confederates talking about? Why are they describing themselves in that way, right? There's this amazing sort of like white victimhood, complex, which we see all the time, but it assumes these incredibly comical sort of guises when we're talking. My favorite is always the Alamo, right? I go to Texas a lot. Remember the Alamo? Like, really? Like, you want to remember how you got your asses handed to you, like, and you got massacred? Like, why are you trying to remember that? And it's got these things like come and get it, come and take it, or whatever. And it's like, yeah, they took it. Like, you lost. Like, but this is really built, and I say it because this is built deeply into contemporary white supremacist and white nationalist narratives, right? Where it's an invasion, where we're being invaded by, of course, being invaded by native people who already live and have always lived on this land, but where that victim complex becomes the grounding for violence, right? And it becomes the motive to act. Because if you are simply there and someone is coming at you in an aggressive way, like stand your ground law, right? Like, you are allowed to do whatever necessary to defend yourself, right? So I don't want to downplay the fact that this white victim complex is a huge part of this, that the neo-Confederacy is built around that, that it's rife, right? That the idea of reconsidering this Civil War history in this moment is crucial to thinking into the present, for sure. Cool. Oh no, now we have all these questions.
Just wondering what is the relationship of religion in between the planter and the poor whites? Like, who's telling who what to believe? And is there anything?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a really solid answer to that. I think one thing that is understated in U.S. history is that we're talking about like fundamentalist Protestantism, right? Which I say this a lot these days. It's like kind of a kind of obsession where it's like the way that we were sold the Reformation as this sort of democratizing process of moving away from Catholic hierarchy and verticalism, saying everyone can have access to the faith, and therefore, like by the end of it, it's just like all you have is a pro-capitalist hyper-individualism that has served, settler, projects across the world, right? So that's crucial, right? And that emerges very strongly when you look at like literatures of people in Latin America trying to figure out what distinguishes them from North America, right? Culturally, ideologically, right? And so that's an important piece to understanding this. But what that looks like between the planters and the poor whites is not as clear to me. Here's my guess, right? The poor whites were irrelevant, right? They were largely irrelevant. The focus of religious indoctrination in many cases was actually focused, on enslaved people, right? On not only establishing, but also very carefully governing the ways in which enslaved people were allowed to worship, wanting them to worship in the right way, bringing in preachers who could provide, biblical readings on passivity and duty, right? And trying to exclude those pieces of religious teaching that would support revolt. And that fails tremendously. It fails dramatically with Nat Turner, who was taught to preach, right? Who was taught this doctrine, and who of course turned that doctrine on its head. So there's this, religion plays this incredibly important role in slave resistance as a motivator, but also as a code, right? It becomes a secret language for, encoding calls for revolts and other things. So that piece I think is super interesting. That was awesome. Thank you all so much for being here for week 3, and I look forward to digging into, the chapter on the general strike next week. So thank you all, and thanks to everyone online. Yeah.